In this video, we are going to find the consecutive transactions with incrementing amount. Hello, I am Jagan from Grow with Data. I am posting this video to share my knowledge in SQL with you. If this assists you in your interview preparation anyways, I will be happy. Let's see the data set and you can talk about the question in detail. So we are given a table called transactions, which got transaction ID, customer ID, transaction date and the transaction amount. Let's create the table first. Okay. Now we are asked to write a SQL to find the customers who have made consecutive transactions with increasing amount for at least 3 consecutive days. There can be multiple consecutive transactions by a customer. We have to return the table order by customer ID in ascending order. So the output has to be like, let's put here. So we have to have the customer ID and the start date of the transaction and the end date of the consecutive transactions. Okay. So here if you see for user 101, we have 3 consecutive transactions on 5.1, 5.2 and 5.3. And if you see the amount 100, 150 and 200. So the amount is getting increased. If you see for user 102, the date is not consecutive. It's like 1, 3 and 4. 2 is missing, right? So we have only 3 transactions and in between 1 is missing. So there is no consecutive 3 transactions. If you see 105, we have 4 consecutive transactions. So it should be at least 3, right? So if you see the amount, it's 100, 150, 200 and 300. So it's increasing. Same way for the same user 105, we have a transaction starting with 12, 13 and 14. So 3 consecutive days and the amount is also increasing. So for 105, we got 2 consecutive transaction groups. But if you see the user 18, we have 11, 12, 13, 14 and 15, 5 consecutive days. But if you see the amount, it has 8200 and then 5200. So the amount got reduced. So it's consecutive, but the condition and the amount is failed. So this user is not eligible. The same way, if you see 13, 14 and 15, 3 consecutive days, but the amount in 14 is less than 13. So the amount condition fails here. So we got only 2 users who is eligible for the consecutive transactions, and as a data point we have 3 sets of data. So 101, 105 twice. So this is what we have to address. Okay, so how to get this done? Let's comment this out. Okay, first let's start with our basic SQL. Select from transactions. So we are going to do a self join. Okay, inner join transactions 2. So both the tables connect with customer ID, right? Equal to T1 dot customer ID. And what are the conditions we have to check? The next transactions amount is greater than the previous transaction amount, and the date difference between the 2 transactions, right? T2 dot transaction date and T1 dot transaction date should be 1, right? So we are taking the transactions table, do a self join and then match with the customer ID and make sure the amount in the previous next day's transaction, T1 is the current day, T2 is the next day. Okay, so the next day's transaction is greater than the previous day and the difference between the transaction date is 1. Now we get the data from the current day. Customer ID and then T1 dot transaction date is the current transaction, T2 dot transaction date is the next transaction. Start transaction date, end transaction date. Okay, so let's start with this SQL. So if you see the output, we have 101. Let's see the data. So we have 101 and the start date is 5/1, the next is 5/2, and the amount, we haven't looked at the amount, but we have a filter condition saying that the T2 amount is greater than T1 amount. So if you put the amount here, you will see it, but it's going to be too much of data. But just for reference, we can just say T1 dot amount, T2 dot amount. The column is too big. We can just say dt end dt. We can change it later. Right. So we have the customer, we have the start date, end date, and the amount difference. Since we have filter, the T2 amount is greater than T1, we get the proper value 1, and the date is, difference between the date is 1. So we got all the conditions ready. Now how will I group it? So 101, we got 1, 2 and 3. So 3 dates are here, and I have to group it. For 101 only one set of data, we can just group it, but 105 we have 2 different sets of data, right? 2, 3 and 4, and then 12, 13 and 14. So how will I group it? We have done that in one of our previous examples, right? The date groups. We are going to try this. Before that, let's clean up the data. So start transaction and the end transaction. We are going to bring in a row number over partition by T1 dot customer ID, order by T1 dot customer ID, and then the key is the transaction date as row number. So now if you see, we have the customer ID and we have the row number. So if it is consecutive, then there is an advantage. If you do a date minus, right, we subtract the row number with the date, we are going to get a magical number. Let's see. With all transactions as, we are going to keep this as a CTE table, and we are going to say select customer ID, start transaction date, end transaction date, and then we are going to do the date subtract start transaction date, and then interval using the rnum as day as date group from the CTE table, all transactions. Now let's see what will this date sub do. Yeah, so the column name is like a big one as end date. Okay. So the date group part, if you see 101, which is eligible, right? The 2 transactions, the date group is going to be 430. If you see the user 105, you see 430 for this 3 transactions, like 101, 2, 3 and 4. The 4 days comes under the same date group. And if you see the transaction for 12 to 14, it's 58, right? So this is the magical number we get if you subtract the row number from the date sub. Okay, great. So we are going to use this for our grouping function. So what we are going to do, this is valid transactions as we keep this as a reference and we simply say select customer ID, and then we are going to get the minimum of the start transaction, start transaction date as consecutive start, and the maximum is going to be the end transaction date as consecutive end from the CT table valid transactions group by customer ID, and we are going to use the date group. And then there is a condition having count star greater than or equal to 2. So we say 3, but why are we saying it as 2 here? Because the two dates are combined here. 12 and 13 is one row, 14 and 15 is in another row, right? So 18 is invalid, so we ignore this. When you go to 101, if you see the two rows, it will cover up 501, 502 and 503, right? So when you say 2, that means it covers up 3 days. That's why we are putting greater than or equal to 2, and we order by the customer ID. So when you run this, you get 101, which got the transaction from 51 to 53, right? And then 105, which got transaction 51 to 54. The next one is 512 to 514 for the same 105 user. So we get the output as expected. So the SQL looks like a bigger one. It's one of the bigger SQLs we talked about till now, but when you go in detail, it's one of the simpler SQLs. When you break down, we just do a self join, and then we apply the two conditions where the amount is greater and the date difference is 1, and then we create a row number based on every customer and order by transaction date. So this is the key data set we have, and using the row number, we are creating a date group based on the date subtract function, and use that date group, we find the maximum and minimum of the start and end date, and we are grouping it, right? So when you break down the SQL, you just can remember it so easily. Great. So this is a row num and a self join. Remember in the previous videos we talked about the lead and lag functions, right? So we are going to use that lead and lag, and we are going to replace the self join. So this is our second approach. Let's see. So we are going to do the same logic, but we are going to replace the self join. That's the only difference here. And yes, the row number, let me continue the SQL and tell you where to place the row number, okay? So here what you are going to try is, let's disable this. We need it in the later case, but here we are going to use only the transaction table once. We just say customer ID and T1 dot transaction date and T1 dot amount. In between, we can just say the lead function, which is the transaction date and 1. That means with the current record, you go to the next record, order by the transaction date, right? So over partition by customer ID, order by customer ID, TOMER, customer ID and transaction date. TRSA transaction date as end date. Okay, so the T1 dot transaction is the current transaction, the lead is going to bring the next records transaction date based on one is the next coming order, right? Order by customer ID and transaction date. And then we get the amount. Same way we have to get the next records transaction amount. So instead of transaction date, we just say amount as end amount. Next amount you can say. MOUNT. So we don't need the T2 transaction. T2 transaction is what? The end transaction, right? The lead one. Okay, let's run this. We delete this. Okay. Now let's see what's happening. Okay. So the column names is like taking more space. Let's run this. Okay. Now what we are doing is we are taking all the users. Let's go to the data and see. If you see 18, user 18 who is not eligible, but still the first record is 2019-08-11, which is the start date, and which is the end date is the next date, which is the lead function brings in here. So 812, and then the current amount is 8244, the next amount is 5205. So this data set will get all the data we need, right? So we can't create a row number in this because there are some ineligible records. For example, if you see this one is having consistent dates, but if you see 1-3, right? So this is not an eligible record. And if you see this one is consistent, good, but if you see the amount, it's a different. So amount should be greater than, which we can't filter in the MySQL database. So in other database like Snowflake or Teradata, we can just say qualify, and you can do a filter condition, like how you do a where condition for normal SQL and having condition for group by aggregate functions. Qualify is for the Windows function, which works in Snowflake and Teradata. I'm not sure about the other database, but MySQL don't accept it. So we can't do it. So first we create this data set with all transactions as, let's keep it, and then use that customer ID dt as the start date, and then end dt end date, and then the next amount and next amount from all transactions, right? So this is what the data we are getting, right, which is the one we just discussed about. Now we are going to add the conditions. What are all the conditions we can bring in? Where the date difference of end date and the date should be equal to 1, and the amount next amount is greater than the amount, right? So these two conditions can be done only here. We can't do it in the first CT table because of the restriction with the Windows function. So now if I run it, now I get all the eligible records, right? So 8, 12 and 13 works fine, 14 and 15 works fine, but there is one condition which we say it should be at least 3 transactions, which we can't get it in this data set. For that, what we did in the previous transaction, we use the row number and then we use the date sub to make a group. We are going to do the same thing here. Row number over same condition which we deleted after copying it, as row num. Let's go with it. So we have to put the T1, okay, T1 customer ID and then the transaction date. So here the transaction date is DT, right? Okay, now we are adding the row number here. Now you remember the same data set we got in the previous transaction. Now we are going to use this CTE table as our main reference. Valid transactions as. So what is the only invalid records going to be is whether it's a 3 consecutive transactions or not, which we are going to fix it here. Select from valid transactions. We are going to group by the customer ID, right? CSUM customer ID, and then we set the minimum of DT as consecutive start and the maximum of end DT, right, as consecutive end from the main CTE table, group by customer ID, MER customer ID. Now we have filter condition saying that where the count should be greater than or equal to 2. I told you why we put 2, right? So one record itself carry the 2 dates 12 and 13, right? So when I do a count star, before doing a filter condition, I can show you what will happen to the count star here. Count star, when you run this, you see the 18, 105, 101. You say greater than or equal to 2, 18 is going to come, right? So we are missing something here. Let's see what we are missing. Oh, okay, the consecutive days. So 18 is coming, 105 is missing. So let's check what we miss here. So we do get the lead data, which is right, we checked on that, and then we came up with next amount, partition by customer ID, order by date, where the date difference is 1, and the next amount is greater than the amount, which is the filter condition, and we say minimum of date, group by group by customer ID and the date difference, right? The row number we have to group by the date, which we haven't done that. Here we have the sub date sub, right? So we missed that group by, that's why we get that. So we are going to say the date difference where the start date is a DT and the interval row num we put it here. Okay, now if you go for it, now you see the difference. So the consecutive days, we got 1, 2, 3 and then 1, 2, 3, 4, which is 3 days, and so you make sure if it's 3 days, then the count is going to be only 2, right? So 3 minus 1, it becomes 2, but when you can count as a date is 1, 2 and 3, so 3. So that's why you put 2 here. And the previously we got the error because when you do a group by, we did only based on the customer ID and we forgot about the grouping data, right? Now we got this. So the second condition is also this almost the same like the previous one, but only thing is we use the lead function and it makes it more easy to visualize the data, right? We can just see what is the current data, what is the next record. We can just visualize in the same record and we can validate it, and then we can go for the row num and the date groups part of it. So when you do real projects, the lead function will be more helpful because you can just compare side by side rather than multiple records. So I prefer the lead function, but only thing is, with a database which don't have the qualify filter, we have to go for one more additional step, and then you bring in the row number and other things. Hope you like this video, and thanks for watching.